going to talk about what it means to have a joyous life, how to be happy. I guess this is kind of a question that most of us would like to know the answer to. We all like to have maximum pleasure and minimum pain in our lives. We like it when circumstances go our way. We love to laugh and love and be loved and have a happy life. I think all of us, to some degree or other, wrestle with this question, how can I be happy? And I imagine if I were to ask the average person, what do you think is the pathway to happiness? I don't think that Christianity would necessarily be the obvious choice, the obvious place to look. I know before I was a Christian, if you had asked me, where do you think you will find the most happiness or joy, I don't think I would have turned necessarily to the church or to God or to Christians. I think the reason is this: my perception of God, and maybe some of you here share this perception, is that he is essentially a fairly angry old guy who is obsessed with telling people what they can't do with their lives, and if they irritate him, he'll, I don't know, throw lightning bolts or illnesses at them or something like that. And so that was my perception of what God was like. And I would think that if that is your expectation of God, chances are you're not going to think that following him is going to bring you the most amount of happiness or joy. That was certainly my view of God growing up. Actually, my view of Christians wasn't a lot better, to be honest. I thought that Christians were essentially fairly miserable people. I mean, you've seen TV, the way that Christians are portrayed on TV shows. Typically, they're the old, grouchy killjoys who look like they've never smiled or stepped foot in a clothes store since the 70s. You know, the kind of, like they take pleasure in complaining about things. And I guess that was my expectation of what Christians would be like. And the funny thing is, actually, when we see that on TV, then real Christians sort of write into TV execs and say, how come you always make us out to be moany people who complain all the time? And they're like, that's why we do it. You know, so my expectation, you know, in Christians growing up was not that they were always the most joyous people. Maybe you know a few people like, well, maybe you are a person like that, in which case I look forward to receiving your strongly worded email tomorrow. But I went to church all my life, and even before I really understood what was going on or believed it, certainly, I remember every week the vicar there, who was probably the most sour-looking individual I have ever come across to date, would say this prayer at the end of every service that baffled me, because he just looked like he was sedated up to the eyeballs, and he would just sort of say, "May you be filled with the joy of the Lord." And I remember sitting there as a teenager thinking, seriously, if that's what the joy of the Lord does to you, I don't want that. My expectation of Christianity was that it was not necessarily going to be the place to go for happiness. I thought that Christianity was essentially anti-fun, anti-joy, anti-happiness. But reading the Bible and now actually experiencing it from the other side, I've realized that is just not the case. And when I read the Bible, I don't see a God who is out to squash my happiness. I see a God who has designed us to experience joy, which is great, because that's my design for my life as well. I do a lot of things to try and maximize my sense of happiness and joy, and God promises joy for us. The problem with my search for happiness is that very often I find happiness that lasts for a short while but isn't sustainable. It doesn't deliver long term. And yet when I read the Bible, I find God say certain things about joy and happiness that he promises us that seem like it's something more sustaining, something with a bit of longevity to it. We've been looking at this passage in Galatians chapter 5, which lists the fruit of the Spirit. These are characteristics that, this is going to go very wrong. Yes, thank you. Okay. Oh, wow, it still went wrong. The problem with only having one hand available is slightly odd. So we've been looking at this passage in Galatians 5, which lists characteristics that God is committed to developing in our lives: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, and so on. These are things that the Holy Spirit generates in the lives of those who follow God. One of them is joy. And I want to talk today about what joy really is and how we can experience it increasingly in our lives. And we're going to look at a passage in John chapter 16 where Jesus speaks to his disciples just moments really, well, not long before he dies, and he is preparing his disciples for this experience. You see, Jesus knows at this point in John 16 that in just a short while he is going to go and die the most horrendous death on a cross. This was not at all what the disciples would have been expecting. You see, they would have been expecting probably some kind of victorious culmination of the Jesus story, maybe a face-off between him and the Roman authorities. They were expecting Jesus to be victorious, and Jesus knew that was not actually the way it was going to go. That he was going to die, he would be buried, but then 3 days later he would rise again from the dead. And in this passage we're about to read, Jesus is preparing the disciples for the emotional roller coaster that they're about to experience in the first Easter. So we'll read from John 16. It will come up on the screen behind me. We'll start at verse 16. Jesus says this, "In a little while you will see me no more, and then after a little while you will see me." At this, some of his disciples said to one another, "What does he mean by saying, 'In a little while you will see me no more, and then after a little while you will see me'? And because I am going to the Father," which Jesus had just talked about prior to this. They kept asking, "What does he mean by a little while? We don't understand what he's saying." And Jesus saw that they wanted to ask him about this, so he said to them, "Are you asking one another what I meant when I said, 'In a very little while you will see me no more, and then after a little while you will see me'?" They said, No, Jesus is incredibly perceptive, and he asked them this, and he says, "Very truly I tell you, you will weep and mourn while the world rejoices. You will grieve, but your grief will turn to joy. A woman giving birth to a child has pain because her time has come, but when her baby is born, she forgets the anguish because of the joy that a child has been born into the world. So with you, now is your time of grief, but I will see you again and you will rejoice, and no one will take away your joy. In that day, you will no longer ask me anything. Very truly I tell you, my Father will give you whatever you ask in my name. Until now you have not asked for anything in my name. Ask and you will receive, and your joy will be complete." Jesus promises something here that is lasting, a joy that no one can take away. And he's saying this to his disciples just before his death and resurrection. And so in a sense, he's preparing them for a very specific experience that we don't go through now. Standing the other side of Easter, we know that story. We know how it goes in a way that the disciples didn't. But actually, I think the joy that Jesus promises here is the same sort of joy we see promised in 1 Peter 1, which Andy read today, or the fruit of the Spirit in Galatians 5. It is a joy that is lasting, that no one can take away. And I want to think a little bit about what that joy looks like, what it is and what it isn't. And a number of thinkers, Christian thinkers, people of all faiths and none, philosophers, theologians, various people throughout the centuries have made a distinction that I think is very important between joy on the one hand and happiness and pleasure on the other. I think it's a very important distinction. And the distinction has to do with this. Happiness is to do with pleasure derived from certain circumstances. Happiness is to do with pleasure derived from certain circumstances. In fact, the word happiness has at its root hap, which means happening or occurrence. It has to do with luck. And so the idea behind happiness is this. If circumstances, if occurrences, if things go your way, you get pleasure from that. But of course, the problem with that is when happiness is rooted in circumstances, what happens when the circumstances don't go your way? And people draw this distinction. They say, well, happiness is related to good circumstances. If bad circumstances come your way, you lose the ground for your happiness. And so people make this distinction between happiness and joy, because joy is ultimately not rooted in circumstances. Zadie Smith, who is one of my favorite novelists, wrote White Teeth and N.W. and some brilliant books. She wrote an article recently in the New York Review of Books called Joy, and it is just full of fascinating ideas that we can't really engage with today. But she makes a couple of distinctions I think are really helpful. And this is someone who is not basing her view on the Bible, on a Christian worldview at all. But she says this: a lot of people seem to feel that joy is only the most intense version of pleasure, arrived at by the same road. You simply have to go a little further down the track. In other words, if you just pile up experience after experience of pleasure, somehow you might get to this intense thing called joy. She says that's not actually been my experience. She goes on and she describes in beautifully poetic language the things that bring her pleasure, whether it's people watching or the 8 minutes it takes to eat a pineapple popsicle, which she says brings her an inordinate amount of pleasure, which is slightly odd, but there we go. She says she has experiences of pleasure every day, but it's not the case that if you simply rack up experience of pleasure after pleasure after pleasure, you get to joy. Joy is of something of an entirely different order. She says this: I have pleasure. It is a feeling I want to experience and own. A beach holiday is a pleasure. A new dress is a pleasure. Not my experience, but there we go. She says pleasure is something you have, something you own. Joy is somehow different. She says with joy, the experiencing subject, the person who experiences joy, has somehow entered the emotion and disappeared. She describes joy as more to do with a state of being rather than a thing you have in particular circumstances. I think that's a really interesting distinction, and it makes sense of the way that the Bible uses the phrase joy. Joy in the Bible seems to be something not rooted in circumstances, because circumstances change and you would lose your grounding for it in a moment. Joy is more a state of being, a state of well-being that exists apart from circumstances. In fact, it transcends circumstances. In John 16:22, Jesus doesn't actually promise happiness. He doesn't promise that circumstances will always go our way such that we will always have a source of pleasure. But he does promise a sense of joy that nobody can take away. A joy that transcends our circumstances. Dallas Willard, who spoke at Christchurch a few years ago, sadly died earlier this year, was a great theologian and philosopher from California, and he says this: joy is not pleasure, mere sensation, but a pervasive and constant sense of well-being. Hope in the goodness of God is joy's indispensable support. I love that as a quote. He's saying joy is not simply pleasure derived from circumstances. It's something deeper than that. Circumstances change and go in an instant. So if you try and find your joy there, you will have it one moment, lose it the next. Joy is deeper. It's rooted in something immovable. It's rooted in the person of God. So when the Bible talks about joy that lasts, that nobody can take away, this, I think, is what it is talking about. Joy is rooted in God. Contrary to the way that many people think about God, and certainly the way I grew up thinking about God, the Bible depicts God as actually being an incredibly joyful person. Psalm 115 says, our God is in heaven. He does whatever pleases him. I like that as a description of God. He is able to do anything that gives him pleasure, and in fact, everything that he does gives him pleasure to some degree. God is a joyous being. He is the most joyous, fulfilled being in all existence. I don't have time to unpack this a great deal, but if you want a book that will really help you, John Piper's The Pleasures of God is a fascinating book. I mean, it's mind-bending and it's hard-going in places, but it'll really unpack something of the joy and delight that God has himself. He has a joyous being. Perhaps we see this most clearly at creation. If you remember how the Bible begins, God creates everything out of nothing, and he creates something and he goes, that's good. Then he creates the next thing, he says, that's good. Now, I don't get the impression he's like, that's good, it's not great. I get the impression that God is excited about the things that he makes. His posture towards creation is one of excitement and happiness and pleasure and joy. In fact, we see this in Proverbs chapter 8. Proverbs 8 is a really poetic section where there's this character of wisdom who is described in the poem as being part of the whole creation experience alongside God. And wisdom says this: I was filled with delight day after day, rejoicing always in his presence, rejoicing in his whole world, and delighting in mankind. That's a beautiful description of God's creation and his posture towards the world. God is not primarily an angry individual insisting on what people cannot do with their lives. His posture towards this world is one of love and delight. In fact, wisdom, it goes on, it describes wisdom as dancing with delight over creation and over mankind. Zephaniah chapter 3 describes God singing, rejoicing with singing over people. God is a joyous God. And this is really important, because if your perception of God is ultimately he is not a very fun person, that he is very serious and very dull, then your expectation of what it means to follow him will be that Christianity is essentially very serious and very dull. That is not what the pages of the Bible tell us. In fact, Jesus, God who came and took on flesh when he walked among mankind, what was said of him? People accused him of being a drunkard and a glutton. I find that fascinating. I don't think that's because he was a drunkard or a glutton. In fact, we know that Jesus was pure in all that he did. But there was something about Jesus that made people think, this is not what a religious person is meant to be like. This guy seems to be enjoying life a little bit too much. Jesus, again and again and again, was found at parties or eating with people that the religious folk would generally not hang out with. Jesus shattered people's illusions of what it meant to be God. Jesus seemed to love life and be filled with joy at every moment. What's your view of God? What is your expectation of what he is like? If it is anything less than him being the most joyous and fulfilled being in all of existence, I would propose that you are not actually having an accurate view of God. He is the most joyous, fulfilled being there is. And my expectation, and the expectation I think the Bible paints, is that following this joyous God will involve us becoming more like him and sharing in his joy. In John chapter 15, Jesus says this, "As the Father has loved me, so I have loved you. Now remain in my love. If you keep my commands, you will remain in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commands and remain in his love. I have told you this so that my joy may be in you and your joy may be complete." Jesus is painting this beautiful picture of a joyous God offering to pour his joy and love into us. And Jesus says, when I have remained in God's love, when I have obeyed him, I experience his joy. Now, if you obey me and remain in my love, that joy which pours from the Father to Jesus pours to us too. And John, I think, goes on to explain that this happens by the Holy Spirit's activity in our lives. When the Bible promises joy, I think it is actually promising that we get to share in the very joy that is rooted in God himself. He is full of joy, full of passion, full of excitement, and he beckons us and invites us to share that joy. How can we experience it? Well, I think there are 1,000,001 answers to that. We'll look at a couple as we go through. But I would say that if you want joy, something that is more lasting than simply happiness, that is good, but which comes and goes. The Bible's answer is to enjoy relationship with the most joyous being in existence, God. The psalmist says, "In your presence, God, there is fullness of joy. At your right hand, there are pleasures forever." I think that's important. It says in God's presence, there is pleasure and there is joy. And it doesn't say that pleasure is wrong, pursue something else, joy, and joy actually is something that doesn't involve happiness at all. No, it draws the two together. Pleasures are good. They come from God. In his presence is fullness of joy. Joy is ultimately rooted in God, which is why again and again the New Testament writers, when they say, rejoice, I want you to rejoice, they don't just say it like that. They say, rejoice in the Lord, because they understand that rejoicing in anything other than a completely stable, immovable God will not last. Joy is rooted in God. Are you with me? Great. Joy is rooted in God. Joy is rooted in the gospel. What does Jesus go on and say? He says, "In a little while you will see me no more, and then after a little while you will see me. Very truly I tell you, you will weep and mourn while the world rejoices. You will grieve, but your grief will turn to joy." Jesus is talking here about the experience of the first Easter. He knows that he is about to die, but then he will be raised again from the dead. And he says that the thing that will change your experience from grief to joy is the resurrection. Christians use this word, the gospel. It literally just means good news. And the heart of the good news of the Christian message is the death and the resurrection of Jesus. This is not something that Christians believe is just a vague idea or abstract thing. It's something they believe literally happened in history. And if it is true that God took on flesh, came and lived amongst us, lived a perfect life that we could never have achieved ourselves, died on our behalf, and rose again from the dead, that changes everything. Jesus says the foundation for joy, the thing that turns grief into joy, is his death and resurrection, the gospel. And Jesus doesn't promise, as I've said, happiness. He doesn't say circumstances will always work out such that you will always have a source for pleasure in your life. But he does promise joy rooted in his resurrection. I find Jesus' words here in this passage really helpful because he's not unrealistic about life. He doesn't give the kind of answer that some religions do, that actually when you experience pain and suffering, it's all an illusion, it's not real. No, Jesus is realistic about life. He's realistic about the fact that life is difficult at times, and this gives me encouragement. Look what he says at the very beginning of John 16. He begins by warning the disciples about the hardships that are going to come their way. He says, they will put you out of the synagogue. In fact, the time is coming where anyone who kills you will think they are offering a service to God. Not the most cheerful conversation with the disciples. Hey, by the way, one day people are going to try and kill you and they're going to enjoy doing it. That's not really a great sort of way of trying to sell discipleship to people that you want to follow you. But Jesus is realistic about the cost of discipleship and the fact that life is sometimes hard. He goes on, he says, you will weep and mourn while the world rejoices. You will grieve. He recognizes that pain is an inevitable part of life, but he says, your grief will turn to joy. Jesus doesn't promise that pain will be removed. Jesus doesn't promise that circumstances will always go our way. And often I think people embrace Christianity with a false expectation of what it might include. People maybe think that if I just follow Jesus, everything will go right. And then when it doesn't, suddenly they get disappointed. Jesus doesn't want that to happen, and so he says up front, there will be pain, there will be struggle in this world, but I can give you something that transcends it all. I can give you a sense of well-being and joy and satisfaction and peace, that whatever the circumstances will carry you through. That, I think, is what Jesus is offering here. He uses this example. He says, a woman giving birth to a child has pain because her time has come. But when her baby is born, she forgets the anguish because of her joy that a child is born into the world. So with you. Now is your time of grief, but I will see you again, and you will rejoice, and no one will take away your joy. Now, I'm not a parent. I've never been at the birth of a child, so maybe I'm on slightly dangerous territory here. But I would suggest that this is not strictly speaking true. It is demonstrably not the case that women go through a lot of pain, have a baby, and immediately forget that they ever had any pain. I think this is demonstrably true because women like to tell me from time to time all about the pain, and I don't like that so much. But we went to visit some friends last week who have just had their first baby, and Helen made the fatal error of saying, oh, how was it? And this friend is particularly frank, and she told us how it was. And what she didn't say was this. Actually, I can't remember. No, I had the baby, but I can't remember if there was any pain. In fact, there may not have been any anguish at all. She did not say that. She said completely the opposite. She told us all about the process. She told us all about the pain and the pain that she was still experiencing 2 weeks on. It was riveting stuff. But Jesus is not here saying, of course, something happens that just kind of makes all the pain suddenly disappear. He's saying with childbirth, what happens is this. You go through genuine pain. He doesn't diminish it. He doesn't deny it. You go through genuine pain, but there is a stronger emotion that comes through and overwhelms it. You don't forget it in the sense that you still remember it happened. But of course, it doesn't stop you doing it again. Actually, there is a stronger emotion that doesn't deny the reality of difficulty in our lives, but it will bubble up and overwhelm our pain and replace it with joy. That, I think, is what Jesus is promising here. We have a God who knows what it's like to suffer. Remember, Jesus said this just moments before he himself went through the most agonizing death. He didn't glibly say, hey, there's no such thing as pain, it's all an illusion. In his mind, he knew, I'm going to have to go through this horrible experience. But he also knew there is a deeper emotion that comes from relationship with God, which doesn't remove our difficulties, but it will overwhelm and transform them. Joy is not the absence of pain. It is something that God gives us that bubbles up and overwhelms and displaces pain, and it is rooted in God, and it is rooted in the gospel. It fills me with such confidence to know that I have a God who knows what it is to suffer, and I also have a God who has overcome the grave. The good news of Christianity is that we have a God who has overcome the grave. And man's greatest enemy, death, has ultimately been defeated. It will be ultimately defeated because God has overcome the grave. The Bible depicts Jesus' resurrection as first fruits. Essentially, that's saying, look, that's the first little ear of corn, as it were. There is a huge harvest to come. And what God has done for Jesus, what God did on Easter Sunday for Jesus, raising him from the dead, God promises to do for this world. Read passages like Isaiah 65 and 66. Read Romans 8. Read Revelation, the end, the final few chapters there. It paints this beautiful picture of God restoring the whole world to a place where there is no sickness, no suffering, no pain, no death anymore. And the reason we can have confidence that he is going to do that is because he did it in Jesus, first of all, on the first Easter. We have a God who has overcome the grave. And when we look at the resurrection of Jesus, we can draw hope and strength from it, knowing that he will do for the world and for us ultimately what he has already shown he can do in Jesus. That hope of a new future, a resurrected world, should be the thing that sustains us in difficult times. I think it's the thing that Jesus himself drew joy from. It says in Hebrews chapter 2, "Let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and the perfecter of our faith. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and he sat down at the right hand of the throne of God." How did Jesus endure the cross? The most painful thing ever to have happened to him. For the joy set before him. He kept his mind on the future, on what God had in store for him and for the world, and that carried him through. He didn't remove the pain, but it gave him a joy that no one else could take away, because he had a confidence, I know what God is about, and I know God is about to put this world to rights. And if Jesus needed that, I would suggest we do too. The hope that sustains us and provides us with joy in difficult times is the knowledge that we have a God who knows what it is to suffer, but who also has overcome the grave. And if he can do that, he can do anything. Some of you, many of you will know how my wife and I have struggled a bit over the last 18 months or so. We've spoken about it from time to time. My wife has had an illness, a fatigue that is thankfully now more or less behind us, but it's been a difficult year and a half in many ways. So when I talk about this sort of stuff, it's thing I've been thinking about. It's stuff that's been bubbling away in my mind and in my life, and I don't think I've always got right, but I think I've learned some lessons on this last year or so. There have been times where Helen was just unable to do anything at all. Early on in the illness, just getting up from our bedroom and walking to the lounge was about as much activity as she could handle during a day. And just to be clear, we live in a London flat. That is not a long walk from bedroom to lounge. It was just exhausting. Headaches, body aches, no energy all the time. Very often she just couldn't go out. She couldn't see people. She had no physical energy, no emotional energy. They were not naturally the most happy times of our life. And yet I think it's fair to say the thing that sustained us during that period, that gave us a sense of joy, was knowing that there is a God who is good, who is powerful, who knows what it's like to suffer, and who has the power to overcome the grave. And if he can do that, what can he not do? And thankfully, as I say, most of that is behind us now. She's back at work full time. Health is restoring. She's able to do most things. There's still a little way to go, but the tide has turned. But there were times where just evening after evening, we would sit there and we couldn't do anything. We couldn't go out. We couldn't have any energy to do anything. We didn't even know what to say to each other at times. We just sort of sit there. There were very few circumstances from which to draw pleasure or happiness. And yet I can honestly say, and this is not just the thing that preachers say because you feel like you have to, there were times where we just knew a peace that seemed odd. Like, where did it come from if it weren't from God? Circumstances weren't naturally feeding us happiness. And yet knowing that there was a God who we could come to, who was a joyous God, and who promised to share his joy with us, did us the world of good. And I think it's fair to say our marriage got stronger during that time. I certainly learned to pray better than I ever had in my life during that time. Spending time with God became a necessity because it fed my soul. It fed our souls, and it got us through. It gave us hope and joy. Joy is rooted in God and rooted in the gospel. And let me be clear as well. Joy does not always look like ecstatic humor and laughing and bouncing around. Sometimes it's just more a quiet, understated sense of peace. And I would hate for you to think, oh gosh, I've got to be joyful. That means I've got to smile all the time and be fake. No, I don't want that at all. We've got to be real. Romans talks about us rejoicing with those who rejoice and mourning with those who mourn. Let's be real. Let's be a community where people can genuinely be as they are. But know that there is a peace, a sense of well-being that God wants to give us when we reflect on his joy and the joy that comes from the gospel. You with me? Great. Okay, very quickly. How do we grow in joy? If that's what joy is different from happiness. It is not rooted in circumstances, but it's rooted in God and the gospel. How do we get it? How do we enjoy it in our lives? I think there are things that we can do to cultivate joy. Joy is a choice. And that may sound like a slightly odd thing to say. In fact, you may object and say, no, it's to do with your disposition. You know, some people are glass half full people and some people are glass half empty people. I am probably more like I hate glass and everything it stands for kind of person, to be honest. Now, you may well say to me, actually, joy is just you have it or you don't, depending on how you're wired. And I'd say, yeah, okay, to some degree that may be the case, but I think you can choose to be more joyful. And one of the reasons I think that is because the Bible often instructs us to be joyful. Philippians 4, Paul says, rejoice in the Lord. He doesn't say, hey, if you're this kind of personality, you will rejoice. No, he says, rejoice. There are things you can do to rejoice in the Lord, so go about doing them. We've told the story of George Muller from time to time. He was a fascinating guy, lived in the 1800s. He lived in Bristol. He built an orphanage. He established many schools to look after young people and orphans. It's estimated that his schools educated over 120,000 people in his lifetime. And in his orphanage, during his lifetime alone, he cared for over 10,000 orphans. This was an incredible guy who achieved so much. His story is just full of things to look at and rejoice for and build your life on. It's an amazing story. But one of the things he said was this. I found it really helpful. He says, my first duty every morning is to get happy in God, because until I am no use to anybody. I love that quote. My first duty every morning is to get myself happy in God, because until I am, I'm no use to anybody. George Muller was realistic about how effective he would be. And he knew that if he was to be effective and do any of the things that he dreamed of doing, it started by him getting his joy in place. What is it that gets you happy in God, to use his phrase? What is it that cultivates joy in your life? And given that we're all wired differently, it will be different for every person. Some people will just find something joyful, and other people will look at it and think that's the most boring thing I could ever think of. What is it that works for you? What is it that helps you to get happy in God? Find out. Find out and make a discipline of it. Build time for it in your life. George Muller says every morning he did it so that he knew he could be effective through the day. If that works for you, great. If you're not a morning person, find something that works for you. What is it that gets you happy in God? Make a discipline of it. Just a few thoughts. And we could talk about this a lot. And in fact, many of the principles we've talked about through the whole series are applicable to cultivating joy. But here are just a few questions for you. How is your thought life? Does your thought life help you to be more joyful? Do you tend to think about things that fuel your joy or fuel your cynicism? I know that I can tend towards being a little morose at times. I can tend towards being a little cynical at times. And sometimes I catch myself thinking just in negative ways. And I think, hang on, that is not fueling my joy. Might it be because the things that I'm fixing my mind on are not bringing me happiness and not reminding me of God and his gospel? Paul says in Philippians 4, he says, rejoice in the Lord always. I say it again, rejoice. Whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable. If anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. How are you reminding yourself of the goodness of God and the power of his gospel? One of the things I do is I try and cultivate thankfulness. I realize that God does so many things for me. I have so many reasons to be thankful, and yet I kind of just forget them and move on. And so when it comes to a difficult time, it's like Andy said the other day, I get wardrobe vision. I look there and I go, there's nothing to be thankful for. Actually, there are many things to be thankful for. And so I try and discipline myself every time I come to pray to begin by thanking God for things he has done in my life. And when I experience particular things that I think, wow, that was an answer to prayer, I write it down. Because I know there will come times where I don't feel great, I don't feel joyful or happy, but actually reading through that reminds me, it fills my thoughts with good things. It reminds me of the goodness of God. How's your thought life? How's your prayer life? This is closely related, of course. Does your prayer life feel like something you just got to get through, or does it feel like something that fuels your joy? Jesus says, "Very truly I tell you, my Father will give you whatever you ask in my name. Until now you've not asked for anything in my name. Ask and you will receive, and your joy will be complete." Jesus says that prayer, bringing our requests and our needs before God and having them answered, should be something that fuels our joy. Is that your experience? Prayer works differently for different people. Jesus would often go up in the mountains and he would pray. Thankfully, that is not the only way to pray, because we would be stuck in London if that were the case. I think Jesus liked to be in nature. I think he liked to be able to see the creation of God, and that fueled his prayer and his sense of joy. Is that how prayer works for you? It might be, in which case maybe try and build that discipline into your life. Don't just pray in a little small room if that actually kills your prayer life. Get out in creation. I'm the opposite, actually. I get distracted by anything. So I'd be walking around, and if the hay fever doesn't kick off, I'll see a butterfly and immediately be oh God, I pray. Oh, wow. It doesn't work for me. For me, I'm like easily distracted. I need to sit in a room with no one else, shut the door, just ignore everything, cup of coffee, focus. That's how I have to pray, because I'm very childish, I suppose. What works for you? What helps you get happy in God? What helps you engage with him? Find out and make a discipline of it. How's your thought life? How's your prayer life? Finally, how's your social life? I mean, that may sound like a slightly unspiritual, odd thing to say, but I think it matters. Are you enjoying life? Are you allowing enough time for you to enjoy life? In a place like London, it's so easy just to get into work every hour of the day, and you sacrifice your social life in order to be able to work, and then you wonder why you don't have much happiness. I think we need to make a discipline of having a good social life, to relax and to enjoy the things that God has given us. We live in an amazing city. God has given us so many gifts. It's a brilliant place with incredible places to walk and art to see and food to eat and things to celebrate. I said earlier, it was said of Jesus that he was like a drunkard and a glutton. Obviously, he wasn't those things, but he just enjoyed life so much that he got this reputation. I think Christians' reputation today is not that we're drunkards and gluttons, but that we're rather dull and irrelevant. I don't know how that happened or went wrong, but I'd quite like to reverse that. Enjoy life. Build time in to relax and to enjoy the gifts that God has given us. And in fact, Jesus had a really rich relational life. Almost every verse or every passage of the Bible, you see him relating with a wide range of people. Who do you spend time with who fuel your joy? You know, there are certain people who you hang out with, and just within a minute or two, the world seems a better place. You know those kinds of people? Whatever your day is like, you spend time with them, within a minute, you're laughing, and just things feel. I'm one of those people, Spend time with me. No, I'm not really, but my wife can tell you, I thought I'd just cut that off quickly, and also I didn't really want, 300 invitations for dinner. No, actually, that'd be fine. Just don't come to my house for dinner. Not all of you at once. But, find people who fuel your joy, not your cynicism, and spend time with them. Spend time around them. Get them in your life. Community is important for building joy. We should be able to draw out the best in one another as we help each other to reflect on the goodness of God and the goodness of his gospel. I wonder if the band can come back up.